Chapter 113. Cut Deep. Summary. Mina finds a spot to recover from her encounter. Content warning. Graphic depictions of injuries. Just one paragraph, but even I think it was kind of icky. Skip from a grimace to next tree over, if you want to avoid it. Her lungs burn, her head pulses, her arm throbs, and her legs ache, but she keeps running. Just a little longer. She needs to get far enough away that they won't be able to find her, because once she stops, Mina's not sure if she'll be able to get back up. At this point, she's pretty sure the drugs that made her limbs lag half a second behind are out of her system. But that doesn't change the fact that she'd been doing back-breaking labor for hours before she was drugged. So many had been trapped and hurt from the quake. There had been so much work to do, and she'd done it, without complaining, planning on saving those for when she was alone with her family. And now it was coming back to screw her. She had to conserve the little stamina she had left. She had to stop and hunker down, preferably somewhere not on the ground. Letting up her sprint ever so slightly, Mina's gaze flits up to the canopy. The trees aren't too thick when they meet the ground, but once they start sprouting branches, they explode out in an arch of curved branches reaching up to the sky. Each tree hooks into its neighbors overhead, holding them steady and creating a uniform canopy. Which was great, except for the fact the lowest branches she could see were well out of her reach. Even as she kept going, there were no outliers to give her a hand. Using her acid would make it obvious where she'd gone if anyone was on her trail. She couldn't get up, but there wasn't anywhere else for her to hide away. She had to make this work. Staring down the tree in front of her, Mina inspected it as she jogged closer. It really wasn't that thick. She could wrap her arms around it, and her fingers would touch. If she got her hands around one side while she used her feet to help her get up the other, she might just make it. Thinking about it made her arm thrum in time with her heartbeat. Gaze hard, Mina used what she had left to burst into a sprint. She jumped up with as much lift as she could manage. The bark was smoother than she thought it would be, as her hands gripped the trunk and her feet pressed against it, but she couldn't think. Letting her momentum help her along, she ran up the wood, her scrambling hands keeping her from falling backwards. She wanted to go slack with relief when her fingers curl around the first branch, but that would send her right back to where she started. So with a grunt, Mina pulled herself into the nest of branches. Immediately, her body collapsed, the springy wood cradling her the most comfortable thing she could imagine. Safe. She was safe. As safe as she could be, but that was enough. For a few minutes, she just lay there, breathing in deep breaths through clenched teeth. She felt like shit, but that was pretty par for the course considering her life. Hero student after all. Okay, first things first. She needed to check out her arm. The blood's not a surprise. She'd bet all the plants on their ship that Irvlin had got her with a knife. It's the extent of the blood that surprises her. Crimson streaks are painted sideways from her elbow to a little above her wrist. Little flecks that had escaped from the mainstream, crusty and dry. The channels all led up to a horizontal cut on her left forearm. A grimace takes her features. It's not life-threatening, but it's not good either. She can see the walls of the top layer of her skin all the way down, the cut stopping just in time to reveal a layer of pink and white dappled flesh drenched in blood. The way the skin is split, it almost looks like a second mouth. That thought makes her turn her head away, focusing on the way the light filters through the orange leaves on the next tree over. It definitely needs stitches, but she can't exactly do something like that here. Instead, She reaches down to her right pant leg and, using her acid to weaken the first bit, tears off a winding strip. The first wad is pressed down on the wound with stuttered breaths. She needs to stem the bleeding. The seconds seem to trickle by as she sits there, but eventually, after the cloth is thoroughly soaked through, it seems as though the bleeding has slowed. When Mina takes her hand off the fabric, it stays clinging to her arm. It's difficult, tying the makeshift bandage tightly around her arm, but she manages. It hurts. She can feel the blood-soaked wad brushing up against parts of her body that should not be able to be brushed up against, but she ties it off with a special type of knot Kotsky showed her. With that taken care of, she can go back to worrying about the people hunting her. Hooray. Her hands are absolutely covered in blood, as is most of her left forearm. A good portion of it is as dark and flaky as the handprints painting the branches. Not exactly the pinnacle of stealth. The prints themselves should be impossible for anyone not in the tree to see, but she can't be leaving kindergarten art projects wherever she goes. Acid bubbles to her palms, and she starts doing her best to wash right away. She makes sure to steer clear of her cut, but everywhere else that's red gets a quick pass. The bark makes unhappy gurgles when she lets, now red, acid drip onto it. But it takes it. Leaves aren't anywhere close to as good as cloth, but she's not about to sacrifice her clothes for this. With each pink-tinged leaf melted away, her skin gets a little drier. Lying back seems to be the only thing she can manage, as the last spikes of adrenaline drain out of her system. It's not completely gone yet. It hasn't been since the general threw that axe at her. She's left exhausted and aching, sprawled out in a nest of branches and wishing she could fall asleep. She's just so tired. She just wants to close her eyes for a little. It can't be too bad. No, she can't fall asleep here. If she closes her eyes, lets exhaustion take her under, she'll be... No, that's not an option. Exhaustion rakes its fingers through her hair, but Mina turns her attention away. What new things did she know about this? She knew for certain that there were other people, groups, looking for her. She knew this was a regular thing they did to criminals, and Leona, whatever that was, apparently her. She knew that they had acid-resistant metal that they used on their wall and their weapons. They also had some sort of spray that they were using where her acid had burned them. It almost felt like they were prepared for her quirk. It's a crazy thought, but why else would they build their wall out of metal it takes hours to melt through? Though, given the discolored teal that had started to chip away at the wall after only a few seconds, the wall would have to be a meter thick for that to be true. Not out of the question, but unlikely. Not many metals were that resistant to acid, and none of them were cheap, even in space. A slight shift of her weight causes her arm to ache, and she grits her teeth. Next time she sees any of those bastards, she's going to break a few bones. That'd keep them down for good, if she broke enough of them. She lets the fantasies of beating the shit out of the people that put her here entertain her. She'll get moving again soon, but for now, she rests.